talking about leaves and branches moving in the wind. Someone said, it's become relatively easy for me, at least now and then, to see an outward thing freshly. Maybe for a moment without a thought. But so far, I have not managed to have that same clear seeing inwardly, sort of seeing inward objects, the thoughts, the feelings. That seems so much more difficult. I wonder whether thought makes it more difficult by thinking about it, how to do it. Am I doing it right? By making it more difficult this way than it really is. So, this moment, the words are spoken, wind moving, the trees and branches and leaves fluttering. Or is there an image in the mind of trees swaying? The trembling leaves and the dancing of light in between them. Is that visible inwardly? The eyes are closed, there's no view of trees, there's an image. Of moving leaves and light. Is there? Or to take something more prosaic, can one visualize one's house, one's bedroom? Maybe the bedroom up in this house, it's the closest. Visualize it as you're lying on the bed, looking to the ceiling or to the window, the wall. You see that, don't you? It's displayed. Not as clearly, obviously, as looking with the eyes open at the knot holes in the floor. The inner vision, if you will, seeing inwardly, is more blurry, more fuzzy. And yet, see, we don't just talk about looking inwardly, we talk about looking / listening / experiencing, touching, the senses at one. So, as is, there can be an image of trees moving or bedroom walls or windows or ceiling, a picture of my house where we live. There can also be the listening to words, which are inaudibly flowing almost all of the time. Thoughts may be made into words, maybe remaining more fuzzy as thoughts. Am I doing it right? What is she talking about? I can't do it, or I'm pretty good at it. Maybe I'm not as good as others. Can we listen in? Listen into the inward sound of words and thoughts and commentaries. And their subtle or very heavy involvement with sensations and emotions. See, not to have any clear picture of what that kind of inward looking is like. That's why it's not good to make a clear method for this. There is none. It happens to human beings. We are becoming increasingly aware with this kind of work in silence of what is going on inwardly as well as outwardly in a clearer way. It happens. It's not just the sound of cicadas and wind blowing, and the words that are spoken, but also some awareness of what goes on inside. Some utterance, some reaction, or maybe a waking up to the fact that there was dreaming, drifting. One hadn't heard what the words were for the last several moments or whatever the time span may be, and suddenly waking up, and maybe the fantasy that was being pursued still reverberating where? Somewhere in the brain, in the body. If it's a pleasant fantasy, the body vibrates pleasantly. Fearful fantasy, the body vibrates unpleasantly. Maybe it's not so much, how do I do this? How do I go about looking inward, seeing my thoughts? But waking up to the fact that this is a thought. A picture about myself or someone else. Right now, sitting here, all of us are sitting here in one mode or another. Is there a body image of the way one is sitting, cross-legged or kneeling or on a chair? An image of oneself sitting here? And if we say yes, there is an image, it means it's visible, experienceable. And can one notice, maybe at first fleetingly, but fleetingly again, and with that learning about the fact that if added to the body image is an evaluation of being very nice looking, very attractive, interesting to other people, or the opposite, judgmental about oneself positively or negatively, can one begin to have insight that these judgments are very involving so that the senses that right now register the sound of wind and birds and insects seem to close up. Everything is now mobilized to participate in this judgment about oneself and others. Not noticing in order to change it, but noticing it in order to learn. Learning takes place inevitably as things are noticed. And maybe with this learning, a tiny sprouting of wisdom. About functioning in openness and functioning in self-absorption. I'm keeping it simple. The complications everybody can add. It happens on its own. And then being lost and saying, I'm so confused, I don't know anymore what you're talking about. Complications, thoughts branching infinitely, make a simple picture very complicated. That is another thing to realize. Not in order to despair over it, but to see the operation of this system, this organism we call me, and by a name. I have an identity for this organism. Not just the identity written on an ID card. It's much more complex than that, isn't it? How I see myself sitting here with added judgments. this ever-creative story about myself, my past history, my past picture albums. The projection of my future story, alone or together, my future family, my present family. What we call identification is seeing as oneself what thought attaches to as mine, makes it mine. And what that means to make it mine, one has to again explore. It is all ultimately ephemeral, elusive. It's based in thought, and the emotions and feelings and sensations orchestrate that story, illustrate it, has sound accompaniment, feeling accompaniment, emotion accompaniment to the story of my life, which includes my family, my roots, where I came from. Attachment to that, or yearning to find out more about one's roots. I'm not saying it judgmentally. I've been through all of that. Right now my roots don't interest me. Not the roots of where I came from historically, with this emotional involvement that we feel, and that may be necessary for someone. I'm not judging it as unnecessary or bad, but it is identification. Me, my country, my nationality, my ethnic group, my gender group, my religious group. So vividly demonstrated in all the collisions that we're witnessing, either directly or, if we're lucky, not directly but on television. Religious collisions, ethnic, national collisions, tribal genocides. My group, the one to prevail, the necessity, it has to prevail. The organism provides the raw material through nervous connections and pictures and ideas to make it necessary that my country survive even if all of the inhabitants die. Amazing, isn't it? Still remembering on a news clip a few years ago of I think it was a Palestinian woman, or was it an Israeli woman? It is the same difference. Saying, even if this generation and all my children and grandchildren would perish, this land will be ours. The power of identification through thought and emotion. So, we started out by saying, can something be discovered inwardly? And it's easier than we think. We take too much for granted that these things of being identified with my company, my household, my patents, my ability or my disability, being identified with it as something real, is not just thought to be watched as arising inwardly in the brain and communicating to the rest of the body. We don't think it's that simple or unspectacular. We cling to the seeming reality of the effects of all of that. And when we become defensive about my group when it is attacked, or my identity when it is put down, my job when it's being criticized, when we become defensive about it, we think that's justified. We may not even think it's justified, we don't even question it, the defensiveness. Going with aggressiveness, passive or active. And here, by talking about it, by probing into it, questioning it, illuminating it, maybe this will kindle an interest to watch what one has taken so much for granted and has thought that one doesn't see that. Oh, it's difficult to see it. So, defensiveness is a wonderful blinker light to watch, or anger arising, disgust, any kind of emotional response, fear. Take it as a blinker light, not just to go with the fear or go with the anger because it's justified, it's human, it's indicated, it's natural. That's my nature. That's how everybody is. But what's happening right now? In the process. And I've often said it, one may find that one doesn't want to watch, one wants to go with the process because it has its own momentum. And there is some kind of pleasure in going with the momentum. Pleasure and compellingness in going with the momentum, like going with the crowd. It's sort of intoxicating, numbing or hypnotizing, and yet is entirely possible and not that difficult to also stop and say, what's happening? What's going on? Because I've been interested in this once, in a retreat, in a talk, while reading a book, while going on a walk. And now it's really happening. It's actually going on. What is going on? And sort of maybe even shaking oneself for a moment to give an instant of attention. Actually, the attention has already happened, or else one would not say what's going on. Something has pierced that thick flow of momentum to go with the anger, to go with the defensiveness, with the disgust at others or at oneself. To sort of switch from rolling to what's happening. And at such a moment, not going with the resistance against it, because that's illuminated, it's seen that there is a habitual resistance to stopping. A habitual addiction to keep going. And when that's seen clearly at one instant of attention, then there is a stopping. Then it isn't that we have to stop, that is the stopping. The seeing is the stopping. And the chirping and sawing and buzzing. And watch that next train arrive. What am I to do about all of this? Or is this all? Watch it, it'll come up. See it. And not just enter it and ride off. That's the beauty of this attention from moment to moment, to see all of the trains arriving, and some of them leave without me. Which reminds of, as a child, my incredible fear of missing the train. It was a nightmare. I haven't recently dreamt about missing a train, but it can happen tonight. We used to go on our big vacation during the summertime, 5 weeks, usually in the mountains. We took a train, and my father, I don't know whether he was trying to tease me, that sort of paranoid interpretation, but he would still wander about, do this or that, maybe get some hot dogs for the family, or I don't know what he did, but he wasn't there. And I was afraid we would leave without him. Let alone the fear of missing the train before he was even able to get back out and try to get something. I'm picturing him wrong. He wasn't that nervous or so. But I was afraid that we would leave without him. I would be afraid that we would not be on time. And people who take me to airports here know that I have to be there on time. I'd rather sit there, and Kyle is even worse than I am. Find myself calming him down the way my dad calmed me down. So now it's the opposite. It's nice to see a train leave without me. You don't have to be on it. You don't have to be on every train that you used to be. Not out of willpower or compulsion, a new addiction to letting trains go, but simple. You don't have to be on it. You see through it from window to window. So, people tell me, and this is what gives zest and an energy to this common enterprise that we're all engaged in. People tell me it's helpful to hear a talk. Maybe one doesn't see at the moment what's been talked about, or it doesn't make any sense, or one drifts off. Or one sees something instantly, or maybe at a later instant, which seems totally unrelated. In the midst of traffic or in the midst of office commotion. Somebody told me this in this retreat. I saw, I forgot it. It was so simple one can forget it. That being judgmental about myself, which is so instant, so habitual, prevents awareness. But the person said, I've heard it probably, I don't know how many times I've read it, but that's not the same as seeing it. And at that instant of seeing, a judgment train riding empty, there's awareness. But getting in the train of self-judgment is not awareness. It's riding. And the beauty of a discovery is that no matter what it is that is discovered, it doesn't matter anymore. But discovery matters a lot. It's joyful. It is a wellspring of energy. maybe just a tiny bit of it. I don't want to invoke comparison. Or some feeling of freeing. Not just mental or spiritual, it's physical too. This all goes all together anyways. There's no separation between these so-called realms. Yeah, maybe for talking or writing purposes one separates it temporarily. But it's all related. The physical, the mental, the spiritual, whatever that is. I'm not saying the spiritual, whatever that is, in order to deny that there's anything beyond psychological, mental, and physical. Beyond meaning not impacted by it, not dented or punctured or colored. Speaking of this free openness, a moment of free openness, which means a moment of interruption, at least interruption of constant self-reference. How am I doing? How is it with my life? What will I be? What am I? What was I yesterday or a moment ago? Freedom from those self-encircling thoughts. And then, someone mentioned this morning, the thought, feeling, something is missing. That thought doesn't occur. That thought doesn't occur when there's no encirclement or being encircled by self-referential thinking, emoting. Then there is nothing missing. Because everything is there. It's logical, but it's also true. So that's what the question came up for me. Where does this thought come from? Something is missing. Even though the state may be one of relative contentment, or at ease, not heaving with roller coaster ups and downs. Some equanimity, at easement. And then does thought roam around, looking, as it were, in from the outside, saying, is that all? Are you really content? Have you got the whole thing? These are unsettling thoughts. I'm not saying unnecessary. They happen. And maybe such an unsettling thought unsettles a manufactured stillness held by thought itself, by concentrating, or whatever one may have learned to bring about a pseudo-quiet space. I say pseudo because thought is involved in upholding it. Willpower, energy, concentration, whatever may be at work, one has to discover for oneself. So then thought peeping in, as it were, and saying, is this the whole thing? Have you really got it? May collapse this edifice. because it lacks reality. So this, coming back to this thought, something is missing. We all know it, don't we? Do we? And in asking ourselves, where does it come from? Not to immediately say, I don't know, and not to immediately get thought to working on it, which it loves to do, to figure out where it comes from, through a thinking process, analysis. What I'm asking when such a question arises is listening, looking quietly, spaciously in the wake of this statement, something is missing. To allow that statement to do its own thing. Wondering about it. What does it mean? Not semantically, logically, verbally, but actually. What is missing? And listening to the missing? I don't know to what. Sort of plumbing it deeply. It seems to be programmed into every cell of this living organism, and maybe of all living organisms. It seems that way, it looks this way. Programmed into every living cell is a desire for continuing, reproducing, belonging. Not the single cell, I'm off of that now, it becomes too complicated. Stay with this organism. Belonging. Finding something in which nothing is missing. That's it, probably. Finding something in which this nagging feeling that something is missing is absent. That's the longing, that's the fantasy. And the fantasy is very powerful to set the human organism roving. Trying to find, trying to get, trying to produce, trying to reproduce. Finding fulfillment. That is a question came up in a talk before retreat. This deep yearning for fulfillment. Nothing lacking, nothing empty, everything fulfilled. No room for discontent. No room for feeling lonely or in fear of abandonment. No feeling of separation. That's our longing, isn't it? Maybe that's why we come here, to find it here. Fulfillment with nothing missing. And the millennia-old tendency has been to picture it, imagine it somewhere in the future, at the end of the rainbow. Find the right partner, the right group, the right profession, the right job, the right people to work with, the right place in which to live. The country if we're living in the city, or the city if we're living in the country. Maybe, not always, but it happens. Can one ponder this and look into it? This tremendous urge toward what comes to mind. There was a movie once. It was called Space Odyssey. I remember very little about the movie except the music. And sort of the logo of this thing was a hand reaching out. Either the ape throwing something, throwing a club, the ape man throwing a club, and then of course a transformation that became, I don't know what, a weapon or a tool or a skyscraper. But this still, in his death, whoever was dying, there's transformation going on from an old face to a skull to an infant face, and this hand reaching out toward, the monolith. It was a crazy thing to reach out for. A monolith. I couldn't get it. Did you see that movie? It's a relatively sober imagination. Reaching out toward something, even a monolith, to satisfy me. From generation to generation, millennium to millennium. And yet here and there have been voices saying, it's all here. You don't have to reach out. Find the wellspring of life right here. Of life and death. They're inseparable. We sort of, in a way, say, okay, I'll do that, but we keep reaching out. And wonder why the two don't mesh. The reaching and the plumbing. They could say, well, plumbing is also reaching. I don't mean it like reaching. It happens on its own with a quiet, still inwardness, but not inwardness in contrast to outwardness, the inwardness embracing or containing the outwardness. In silent wonderment of not knowing what this is all about, but realizing it's not about reaching outwardly. Anything. Whatever comes is here. So what does it mean being here? And nothing is missing. Does it mean folding up? Imagination can immediately go to work on this. Does it mean to stop working? Stop being creative? Composing music, poetry? Intrigued by computers? All of that is in vain, vanity. There's the traditional orchestrations for all of that. You see, this is speculating and theorizing out of a state of something missing. No, it doesn't mean any such idea. What does it mean? We have to find out for ourselves, don't we? No one can tell us. And if we are not in touch ourselves, we can be deceived or roped into some scheme. The more we want, the more gullible we are. I mean, the more we are wanting that thing. So it's a real beauty that we can work together and talk together, question, point out things, but ultimately insight has to happen on its own for each one of us. And it does. Does it? Not to make any ideas out of it. It's climbing into the train again. This blowing air, is that an idea? It's an idea, but it's also real. And cannot really be captured by an idea. It's blowing. We will end here for today.